I'm going to make an ICord button closure for my enclosed jacket, and I've drawn here a picture of what I want the enclosure to look like. You can do whatever shape you want, and if you want to be really creative, you could have a look at Celtic knots or Chinese knots as a way of getting some inspiration. I've got some thick piping cord here, and I've secured the end just with a piece of sellotape to stop it from fraying. And I've laid my piping cord out over the shape, like so, and cut the other end at the correct length. This gives me an indication of how long I need to knit my ICord. So we're going to start knitting our ICord now, and I'm going to cast on 4 stitches. If you want a slightly thinner cord, you could just cast on 3 stitches, but I want mine to be nice and plump. Okay, the first row we are just going to knit across the row. At the end of the row, push your stitches to the other end of the needle, knit across again. After knitting the first stitch, be sure to pull it nice and tight. You'll see how that bunches up these stitches, and that's what you want to see. Knit across the row again. The end of the row, push the stitches to the other end, and just repeat the previous step. So again, after that first stitch, just pulling it nice and tight and knitting across. I'm just going to repeat that for about 20 rows, and then we'll be back to see what that looks like. So we've knitted another 20 rows, and this is what our ICord is starting to look like. This is the front, and if we turn it over towards the back, you can see that it forms a nice tube. So I'm going to keep knitting until I've knitted the desired length, and we've got to the length of the piping. So we're going to bind off. To do that, again, we push our stitches to the other end of the needle. Knit 1 stitch, and we pull it tight because we still want our bind off to be part of a cord or a tubular shape. Knit the 2nd stitch and then pass the 1st stitch over. Knit the 3rd stitch, pass the 2nd stitch over, and then knit the 4th stitch and pass the previous stitch over. Okay, then I'll just cut our yarn. We'll break it, and we'll just pass that yarn through the last stitch, pull it tight. When I sew the ends together, I want to use a normal sewing thread rather than wool because it will be more invisible. With the ends, I've just got a sharp needle, and I'm just going to pass the needle through the ICord tube and then out almost an inch below the end. and then I'll just trim that away so that end is now inside the tube, and I'll do that with the other end. I'm just going to sew the ends together with my sewing thread, and then we'll stitch it onto the garment. So I've sewn my I-cord ends together, and I've now got a loop. I've still got my thread and needle attached where the join is. And on the opposite side of the circle, I've just placed a safety pin, which will help me make sure my closure is centered. I've marked a pin where I want the center of the closure to go, and so I'm just going to stitch that in place with a couple of stitches. So this is how I'm going to shape my closure, and I just want to make sure that the end of the closure just goes beyond the edge of the band so that the back of the button isn't pushing the band towards the closure when the garment is closed. I'm then just going to run my thread up and secure this part of the closure, and then once that's done, it's pretty straightforward just to stitch the rest of the closure down. So getting it in position, just make sure those edges are equal, and that's where the safety pin is useful, because you know that should be at the very top of the closure. Okay, so we'll just run some stitches. Okay, so that's just secured that in place now, and we can just run around the edges with our needle and thread and sew the rest of it down. And as you can see, I've just left this component not sewn down, and that's so the closure is wide enough to get over our button.